All right. Hello, everyone. Glad you could join me. My name is Jeff McJunkin. Today, we're going to be talking about some top Active Directory attacks. And by the way, feel free to ask questions throughout the entire presentation. You're listening to past Jeff, and present Jeff will be following along and happy to help you with some questions. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Hi, I'm Jeff. I have a slide at the actual end to talk more about me if I've earned your attention by then. So today, we're going to be talking about framing what defenders have to do, right? For real world, realistic breaches, what do things actually look like? What's our goal for today? Where are we honing in? Then the bulk of the presentation on Active Directory attacks and the application, what you can do the moment you get back to work. And then of course, some dedicated time for Q&A as well. So first, let's talk about different ways of conceptualizing end-to-end breaches. It's obligatory at some point to have the MITRE Enterprise Attack Matrix on screen. And don't get me wrong, MITRE Attack Matrix is very useful for having a common language to describe attacker actions. But for the vast majority of breaches, it's going to be a very small subset of these attacker techniques that are going to be in use. So I love MITRE Attack. I don't think it's a great way to visualize a normal end-to-end breach. Similarly, there's the Lockheed Martin Cyber Kill Train trademark, right? And this is useful for conceptualizing maybe from the attacker's perspective, but I think less so from the defender's perspective. So let's keep things simple. Here are 4 things that pretty much every attacker or attack needs. You're gonna need some kind of internal access for reasons we'll get into. You're gonna need some privileges to accomplish your attack. And then the probably most discounted step, finding the actual right data if the goal is copying and exfiltrating data, and then the actual copy, the actual exfiltration to work with. So for internal access, it's almost always via phishing. For real world breaches, the best data we have says 90+% of known public breaches started off with email-based phishing, right? But there's only the 5 ways listed on screen in practice. We have phishing for code execution, exploitable public-facing services. This is the classic example of exploit something on the DMZ, touching the internet, and then pivot internally. There's normal authentication, remote desktop, VPN, virtual desktop, etc. There's inserting rogue devices like a good old Raspberry Pi left behind. And then we have supply chain attacks. SolarWinds. So there's only so many ways internally or to get inside the target environment. And yes, hat tip, Tim Malcolm Better wrote a great article and linked. And by the way, there's plenty of links throughout the presentation and slide notes that you can access because I'll be sharing these slides as well. So as far as external versus internal, why do we need internal access as an attacker? Right, from the outside perspective, using the very common analogy of castle, right? There's only so many ways to approach the castle, to storm the castle, and people are very careful about what they expose to the outside world, to the public internet. But once you're inside, right, this actual view from inside a modern day castle, there's a lot you can just kind of wander around and gain access to. You can think very similarly for larger campuses, right? For Microsoft campus, getting in the door might be rather difficult, but once you're inside a general office building, most doors are open, you can wander around. And to make this a little bit more technical as well, let's talk about a 10,000 employee company. You might have, to an order of magnitude, about 100 externally available services, and those tend to be chosen rather carefully. You have your classic email, VPNs, mini websites, DNS servers perhaps. But internally, again, order of magnitude, you have way, way more services than you have employees. Between employees' desktops or laptops or virtual desktops, but also the networking infrastructure, also the servers inside. So it's just the tip of the iceberg on the outside. And of course, attackers want internal network access. All things being equal, each particular service only has so much chance of being having some unpatched vulnerability if taking advantage of exploitable flaws is the attacker's way in. Because I've done lots of successful penetration tests, by the way, never taking advantage of patchable flaws, and instead taking advantage of features. But I digress. So we know why we need internal access. There's just a lot more attack surface to work with. But we also need a lot more in the way of privileges to take out or to accomplish a most common attacker actions, right? So speaking of a rather famous Twitter breach last year, July, June timeframe, look, there's around 5,000 employees. Only 100 or so, allegedly, have access to the admin Twitter console where they could, in fact, hijack popular Twitter accounts. For your on-prem world, going back to that 10,000 employee example, there's probably, on the order of magnitude, about 10 domain admins to work with, right? Hopefully 10 or fewer, but I've seen organizations that get closer to 100 domain admins, which is terrifying, as by the way. Anyway, once we have some privileges, right? Often on a penetration test, it doesn't take long to get those privileges, but actually like looking up and saying, oh, now where am I? And where's the data I want to go for, right? Even though we have those permissions, finding the right data on the right server is hard. Now, if we have a generic goal, like gain access to credit card data, which we could sell online. Well, people have used, or abused, I should say, software used for searching for the sensitive data internally for attacker purposes. In my head, that's a little bit of an endorsement for the specific software, Ground Labs Enterprise Recon, but I have no commercial relationship with them. But every time you start looking for, this is the data, this is the pattern that we know, and here's where it's supposed to be, you almost always end up finding, oh, that data ends up here because of staging, and the developer brought it over to this dev environment over here, and we have another copy over here. We don't know why it's here because the person involved has since left, right? So this is why we want to proactively start looking for this data internally. And then actually copying that data, actually stealing that information, exfiltration, this doesn't take very long, right? And by the way, it could be not just affecting confidentiality, but integrity or availability, right? Encrypting or destroying in place or changing some of your data. It depends on what the attacker is doing. But normally by the time the attacker has gained privileges and found the data, it's a really tough game, nigh impossible to kick them out at that point before they're able to accomplish their last bit of their goal, copying and stealing that data. And sometimes, by the way, steps 3 and 4 could just be deploying ransomware. And this can be a terrifyingly quick operation, right? So on the right, we have a report from the DFIR report referring to a ransomware case. So essentially, the DFIR report builds up fake enterprises and purposefully gets them compromised. It might be clicking on links in email. It might be opening some malicious attachment. It might be having a remote desktop server exposed to the outside world with a guessable password. But in this case, the NetWalker ransomware took all of 1 hour, 65 minutes if you want to be precise, to go from initial access to ransomwares deployed to all domain joined machines. That's tough, right? So here's the big high-level picture. To prevent successful breaches, right, the attacker accomplishing their goal, defenders need to both detect and respond to attackers before they accomplish their goal. So on the left, I have, well, the defenders, and the defenders might have a very long path. When you think of initial access may have been noticed by the Security Operations Center, and maybe they need to hand things off internally to do host-based forensics on that box before they find out that the attacker has already moved, right? Sometimes the defense timeline takes a lot longer than the attacker timeline, especially if you have some of these pretty common ways for attackers to gain privileges, right? So if the attacker's timeline is shorter than the defender's, that's not a great situation to be in, right? So you have two goals as a defender. You want to shorten down your timeline to detect and respond and eradicate the attacker's presence, right? You also want to make it take longer for the attacker to win, right? So you want to take their short timeline and lengthen things. Because prevention, sure, is ideal, but you cannot prevent 100% of initial incidents. It just can't happen, right? So I suppose the filter on the right side of the screen is referring to preventive controls. So this is why we want to prevent as many incidents as possible, but really hone down on detecting what's left. So we minimize those incidents, but we detect and we accelerate our response. Because, I mean, in the physical world, with a safe, for example, safes are not rated to keep attackers out forever, right? They keep attackers of a certain capability. Here, a hammer weighing less than 3 pounds, a pry bar less than 18 inches for 5 minutes or more. I mean, that's a pretty low bar, but it means that you're not having 100% prevention to work with. The goal is to slow down an attacker and gain you some access. So if an attacker can gain initial access, internal access, and privileges in less than an hour, let's say, that's a really tough game as a defender to detect and respond and eradicate the adversary, because the game gets a whole lot harder when the attacker has already gained privileges and persisted in multiple ways throughout your environment. So let's remove some of these easy wins from the attacker perspective and make it take longer. And when they're looking for these easy wins, that is behavior that is fundamentally different than your normal network users. So it can be a way to detect the adversary as well. The defenders do have a home court advantage if and only if they use it. So today's goal is honing in specifically on step 2, where the attackers gain privileges, right? The assume breach model is a far more interesting type of penetration test where we assume some amount of initial access from the attacker perspective. It's going to happen. Statistically, it is inevitable, right? So after attackers have that initial access, then things are a heck of a lot more interesting. In my hot take, right, to have a chance as a defender, the attacker cannot win in less than a day, especially for most environments where, let's be honest, you probably cannot get the alert in front of the right human being in less than a minute. You can probably not take corrective actions in less than 10 minutes. And that makes it much harder. You need more time for your detective and responsive controls to have some time to work with. All right, so a realistic threat model, therefore, is assuming breach, assuming that the attackers will phish for code execution and gain internal network access as an authenticated user with non-administrative access. And that quote, by the way, about 90+% of breaches being email-based phishing at the beginning is from Verizon Data Breach Investigation Reports. It's pretty good data to work with. So now let's get into the meat of the presentation on the top Active Directory attacks. One is password spraying. The year is 2021, and the average user authenticates to the average machine using a username and a password. All right? And if a user chooses their own password, humans are rather famously bad at generating pure randomness, pure entropy. So my bet and my experience is that between 0.5% and 1% of user accounts will use one of a variation of the word password, a variation of the word welcome, a variation of the company name, or a variation of the season and year, right? Because many people are required to rotate their credentials periodically, let's say every 90 days. And hey, look, unless you live in the Bay Area, you can tell seasons by looking outside. So as far as single factor authentication services, those are external and internal. And my goodness, have you tested the phishing success rate of your organization, when the attacker is using an internal email address, right? Phishing rates go up way, way higher when the attacker is sending an internal email address. And there's all sorts of single factor authentication services, perhaps most notably internally, SMB, Windows file sharing internally, right? So related but separate to password spraying is something called credential stuffing. It's still password guessing. I'm still authenticating to an online system, but it's using compromised passwords associated with that email address or with that human being, right? So lots of organizations have been compromised in the past, unfortunately, and many times attackers have revealed email address : password or password hash from that organization. And most of your users, yes, your users, probably only have so many passwords, and let's be honest, it's probably closer to one than we would like. So the idea of credential stuffing is taking these known breached credentials and stuffing them into some single factor authentication service. There's a whole other presentation I've done on credential stuffing, so I have the link in the slide notes for that, which has a video associated as well. Another major problem, one I come across in it, literally every penetration test I do, is some publicly accessible file share that has some very sensitive information inside. Why does this happen? Well, we have departments that have their own departmental shares, of course. But you have this issue of wanting to share across multiple departments. And you might think, okay, so every pairing of departments, we're going to create a file share for them. Oh, but wait, sometimes we need 3 departments to share some files. So in practice, what happens in every penetration test I've done is there's some number of company-wide file shares that everyone can access. And people start treating this file share as if it was fairly protected and have things like credentials inside. Sometimes I've seen organizations treat it as your user's home directory, your redirected profile, but it's not actually redirected. It's just that everyone makes their own folder under some share to work with. So I'll talk through some of the defenses, some of how I will search for these when we get to the apply section. Don't you worry. All right, next up, DNS fallback abuse. So we look up host names, right? I want to connect to the file share on file 1 or whatever the computer name is. But your computer does not connect to names, it connects to IP, v4 or v6 addresses. And DNS is what we use to look up those names, resolve an address, and connect. But if there is a failed DNS request from any of your machines, then Windows, before just giving up, will actually do one of a couple of different protocols and essentially broadcast, hey, has anybody heard of this old server name? Because plenty of endpoint agents will try to look things up while running as the user, trying to get access to that old server, or typos. Typos certainly happen as well from the user perspective. You don't get prompted for your credentials every time you try to log on to some internal file server. No, that's what single sign-on is for. Well, single sign-on can also be abused from the attacker perspective. So once an attacker has gained internal network access, they can abuse this DNS fallback. And there's a number of tools to help us with this as an attacker between Inve and Responder as well. Another common issue is, look, printers in general, and all the IT people groan simultaneously. And yeah, these MFPs, multifunction printers, oftentimes they're configured to, for example, share or save your scanned document to some file share, right? Or maybe send an email out from this MFP. That means in practice, they are configured with some credentials, some valid Active Directory credentials. Problem is, these MFPs have web servers that anyone with internal network access can reach. So there's a number of ways to abuse this. Sometimes you can just unhide the asterisks of the password or export the backup, or worst case scenario as an attacker is point the server, the LDAP server, Active Directory server at yourself and hijack that inbound authentication request, right? So next issue is Kerberoasting. Wait, Kerberoasting is hard. Let's talk about normal Active Directory login process first, because there's a lot of moving parts. So first, Kerberos itself is named after Cerberus. That's the 3-headed guard dog of Hades. And I like that Cerberus as the name because each of those 3 heads of Kerberos represent one of the 3 major roles we have to work with inside of Kerberos actions. And by the way, Kerberos exists outside of Active Directory directory services. All right, there's MIT Kerberos, but for the most part, when you hear Kerberos, you're probably talking about on-prem Active Directory, whose full name is Active Directory Directory Services. Inside of Active Directory, inside of Kerberos, the most common scenario we're going to talk about is a client who wants to gain access to a service of some kind, and they both trust some domain controller. And these services, right, each computer could have multiple services registered, like Microsoft SQL Server and a file server on the same box, or a print server, as well as a file server, etc. But yes, you connect to a service, not a server. So let's talk about each of those three roles, and each of those three roles has a secret. The client's secret, like username Jeff, is derived from Jeff's password. Specifically, we use the actual password hash. There are a few forms of it, but your password hash is the thing that authenticates you, not the password. This is why pass the hash works. I digress. Right? Domain controllers have a very special secret account, and that's the KRBTGT. You may hear this pronounced as KRBTGT account password hash, right? So it encrypts a portion of this ticket granting ticket. Don't worry, we'll talk about that here shortly. All right, and the services secret is derived from whatever the services user or computer account password is. Yes, computer accounts are domain accounts. They're not a member of domain users, but they're a member of domain computers, and they are authenticated users. They really do have associated passwords and password hashes. So if I connect to a service associated with a computer, then I'm connecting to a service whose computer password forms that secret. Let's see how those secrets are used first. First of all, this is the normal flow. Don't worry, I just felt you freaking out for a moment. We'll talk through each step. We have three major flows to work with. The first one is circled on this slide, the initial logon, right? And by the way, this is coming from a great YouTube video linked at the bottom. It's great explanation, but let's give some analogies. I love a good analogy. All right, steps 1 and 2 from that prior slide are logging on. All right, you prove that you have access to some user account, and this is what happens behind the scenes when you connect to a domain join machine, Control-Alt-Delete, enter your username and your password. Behind the scenes, your computer is doing this step 1. Proving access to your password hash. Technically, it's encrypting a user, a timestamp with your hash, presenting that to the domain controller. And from the domain controller, you get this thing called a ticket granting ticket. And this is where I'm going to introduce the analogy of the magic band, right? At Disney World, you do not prove your identity for each and every transaction. You prove your identity once when you're checking in at the first day, and you get this token, this magic band that you use for everything inside, whether you're walking up to a ride or trying to purchase something internally, right? So, by the way, that means if I gain access to someone's magic band, I can take actions as them, right? So let's look through the next steps, right? Steps 3 and 4. These are repeated multiple times. Like, for example, if I log on, continue that analogy of, well, Control-Delete, username and password, and you've logged on and you find out that you have a redirected profile. So even though you've logged on talking to a domain controller, you need to go talk to a file server to load that mapped drive letter, that redirected profile, right? And in the physical world at Magic Kingdom, in order to go on a ride, you would present your magic band, your ticket granting ticket equivalent, right? Because it's a ticket that grants other tickets. It's a ticket that grants ride tickets, service tickets is how it's known inside of Active Directory and Kerberos, right? And usually you hear this referred to just as a service ticket. And this service ticket, by the way, will be, you're still just talking between yourself, the client, and the domain controller, but the file server in this example, the service ticket can be validated by that file server because the domain controller has everybody's secrets. That's how we could log in step 1, by the way, because I prove access to a password or password hash more properly, and the domain controller has my secret as well. Domain controllers have everybody's secrets. So that service ticket that you get has a portion that's encrypted with the service's own account password hash so that the service can verify it. But let's get into that, right? Now, the domain controller is happy to hand you a service ticket for every service, right? Your magic band doesn't fail to let you walk up to any ride, but authorization, right, what you're allowed to do does depend on that target service. Domain controllers, for the most part, care about authentication, who you are, not authorization. Right, this is built for scalability, and everything in Kerberos is designed for scalability. So that service ticket, that ride ticket that I got, I can then present that to the file server when I'm actually using the service. And the service can validate, yep, this must have come from the domain controller because it's signed with my own account password hash. So they can validate that it's correct because, again, the domain controller has everybody's secrets. And you, of course, couldn't forge your own magic band or your service ticket because that involves secrets that you don't have. Oh, wait. If you had that very special account, KRBTGT, that's the shared secret that domain controllers use to create and validate magic bands, ticket granting tickets. So if you've already compromised that environment, right, gain domain admin, dumped those credentials via DC sync, or gain access to a improperly secured domain controller backup, if you've gained access to that password or properly password hash, you can make your own ticket granting tickets. You're skipping the logon and just moving on to service tickets and using services. You can claim to be whoever you want to be. You can forge your own magic bands. And look, golden ticket seems to be more valuable than a silver ticket, but a silver ticket is creating your own service ticket. Because we said that a service ticket has a portion that is encrypted with the service's own account password, as their own secret. So if I've already compromised that server, I can walk up to that service sometime in the future and forge whatever service ticket I want. All right? And by default, servers don't validate their service tickets back to the domain controller and ask if it's legit. So you don't actually need the KRBTGT account password hash for a silver ticket. You just need to have previously compromised that one server. And this finally brings us to Kerberoasting. And I'm going to start off with the Kerberoasting TLDR. All right? Any user account with a registered service has effectively no lockout policy, which is rather terrifying, right? A lockout policy is what stops people from doing hundreds or thousands of guesses, because out of my top million guesses, it's pretty likely that I'll get a significant number of user accounts or their passwords, right? So these user accounts with a registered service are called Kerberoastable because, remember, domain controllers will happily give you a service ticket for any registered service in the domain. Now, there's lots of ways to register services. Each computer account gets a file service, essentially registered by default. User accounts do not have registered services by default, but there's all sorts of ways that admins will install services or register services to Active Directory. Easy example is Microsoft SQL Server. When you're installing it, the SQL Server wants to register to Active Directory so that people know where to find it and can get a service ticket for it. And the easiest way to do that is the user account who installed Microsoft SQL Server can register it using their own user account, which is likely domain admin. And if I can take unlimited guesses as to a domain admin's account, out of the first few billion, I have a significant chance of guessing. Now, the only problem with the Kerberoasting TLDR, no lockout policy, is that the lockout policy implies that it's online password guessing. This is actually a Kerberoasting is an offline password cracking. Because once I have that service ticket, I can take a guess as to the password, get the hash for that guess as to the password, and attempt to decrypt that one portion of the service ticket that has been encrypted with the service's own password hash. If I'm successful, then I had to have guessed the right password to derive the right password hash. Otherwise, I can just repeat, and that's all on my own hardware, my own password cracking rig. It's an offline attack after that initial service attack. So there's been plenty of people who will point out this latest craze. And don't get me wrong, I've fallen for the shiny blinking box a time or two, but I love the analogy. David Weston over at Microsoft made this one, that people want some magical cure-all pill. I'm sorry, preventive and detective controls are the equivalent of diet and exercise. We're still looking for a magical pill that you can take and replace diet and exercise, and we're still back down to the fundamentals work, preventive and detective controls. So let's get into the application. For Kerberoasting, it's really easy to search your environment for user services user accounts with registered services. There's a utility called Rubius that can do exactly that. It can even give you a crackable output format. It's one a lot of attackers are using that tool or very similar. The issue, as we discussed, is that attackers can take unlimited guesses as to the password. So you want a really good password is what it comes down to. You can make a fine-grained password policy. If it's random, 15 plus characters is good mathematically. If it's human generated, let's add some more, 20 plus at least, and then apply that fine-grained password policy. This means you can have specific users or groups with their own password policy, by the way. And look, you can audit these Kerberoastable password hashes and prioritize the ones that are crackable, but that gets a little bit more complicated, right? And then over a longer period of time, let's say the next 6 months, figuring out where these services are actually used, right? Looking for event log 4624. Look, if it's not used over a longer period of time, you can remove that registered service. That user account is no longer Kerberoastable. Problem solved, right? And if it was used and something breaks, you can re-register the exact same service. It's easy to back off from that. Otherwise, if you do need that Kerberoastable user account and the associated service, then you could reset the password to meet the new fine-grained password policy, or you can migrate to a managed service account. This is something where Active Directory domain controllers manage the password, have really good entropy, and rotate them automatically. Essentially, computer accounts gain access to a given associated password for a user account. If you're password spraying, 4 words, right? Azure AD password protection is an amazing capability that Microsoft has introduced. So they have their own list of banned passwords, essentially passwords that have already been known to be compromised, which NIST requires you to check, by the way. And you could also add your own list of up to 1,000 custom banned passwords, like variations of the word password or welcome or seasons or the company name itself. So what is the actual steps behind it? You install that small agent that you probably already have installed on your domain controllers, all of them on-prem. You start in audit mode where you get a warning, this password would have been blocked for a while, and then you make the switch at some point to enforced mode, where users trying to set a known bad, known compromised password will get a warning, right? And not be able to set that password. So for printers, this is one where I've gone a little bit further because step 1 is find all of your internal subnets. You may know some of them offhand, and your network admins for each physical location or each subsidiary may know some of theirs, but here's the methods I use. I look for domain registered DHCP servers, and I get their ranges, right? And there's a PowerShell script that I've shared in the slide notes here called get internal subnets that does that. And I also find the IP address associated with every single domain joined host and take the /24 CIDR notation of that. So even if 192.168.1.100 was never mentioned in a DHCP range, if I find one system with that IP, I'll still scan 192.168.1.0/24. And then scan using Nmap each of those subnets looking for web servers. Then we take a screenshot because there's going to be a lot of them. And triaging is much easier with Chris Trunser's utility called Eyewitness. And I have the exact instructions and links again in these slide notes. And then you review and triage those results. Maybe you can password protect a given web server. Maybe you can reduce the permissions. So yes, this user account that can save to a file share, maybe it can just save to the one file share and not have credentials that are way more powerful than they need. And by the way, you're going to find a lot of random web servers throughout your organization that you probably don't have great visibility into because, I mean, they're not necessarily domain joined. They're not necessarily phoning home to your normal reporting. All right, so over a longer period of time, what I'd like you to consider is also separating out your printers, your MFPs, to a dedicated VLAN, dedicated subnet, where only the print server can access those print servers, there's MFPs. It's really, really nice. We can just remove some attack surface entirely. And even if you have to allow the print servers and also this IT subnet over here, that's still a heck of a lot better than the default, which is every internal user can access all of those MFPs. All right, next up, the file shares that have some sensitive information inside. First of all, just next week, as soon as you get back, you can look at a utility called Snaffler, right? Funny name, amazing results. So Snaffler searches for known bad patterns, like web.config files for IIS web servers with embedded credentials, right? There's all sorts of known bad formats that end up having credentials embedded or some sensitive information. And then you can start removing or moving to a secured location or locking down in place those sensitive results, right? Now, that's the short-term action you can do. Long-term, this is going to take a little bit longer, but it's a really good use of your time. Find open file shares. Here I have a screenshot of PowerView. That's the find domain share commandlet, as it's known. And I have an actual command that I use for penetration tests to find file shares that I have access to, and then output them in the /computer name /share format. Then I can start looking through them. Certainly I do some manual, but there's probably going to be a lot to search through. So one thing I love doing is using desktop search applications, adding those file shares and have them start to index. So you can take local guesses using your search index, and that indexing process might take a long time, might take a few days, might take several weeks. That's okay. It's going to be useful for you for a long period of time, and you can start to search for patterns that are more sensitive to your organization in particular. And by the way, if you have a template internally, like not to be shared outside of this company, that's a great thing to search for because an exact string match is pretty easy to work with. All right, next up, DNS fallback abuse. This is the essentially broadcast protocols. You can spot check. Open up Wireshark, have the filter LLMNR or NBNS or MDNS, link local multicast name resolution or NetBIOS name service or multicast DNS. Look for those and find out that when you disable on a few random IT workstations, everything works as normal. It's not going to make a difference. I'm saying start with IT because it's usually easiest to start off with there. And I have some resources in the slide notes here as well. As far as fallback abuse next, I mean, you can expand disabling these protocols. You probably don't need them because remember, DNS fallback means that DNS has already failed. So why has DNS failed and why you're depending on this fallback protocol, that's where I think you should spend your effort. While you're at it, disable WPAD, Windows Proxy Auto Discovery. It's a bad protocol, right? Essentially looks for the host name WPAD and sends the web traffic there. That's bad. Another thing you can add is enable SMB signing. It's enabled by default on domain controllers. It has not been much of an issue on your domain controllers, right? You can expand that out and it protects against SMB relay attacks. Again, more links to work with in the slide notes. And lessons learned. Every time an attacker gains that initial access, they have internal network access, it starts a race. Your job as a defender is to detect and eradicate the attacker's presence before they are able to persist, gain privileges, and accomplish whatever their goal is. So you need to understand your own timing. How long does it take you to detect and eradicate the attacker, right? This type of unit testing is sometimes referred to as purple teaming. And you also want to figure out how long does it take an attacker to win and increase that time frame. And we call that penetration testing and remediating that low-hanging fruit. So I have some dedicated time for questions, but as promised, hi, I'm Jeff McJunkin. I'm a consultant, I'm a little bit of a generalist, but I do have some specialties. I also teach for the SANS Institute and own a small class there. And I try very hard to help companies understand and then reduce their own realistic risks from real-world breaches. These slides are online at the URL below, and my email address and Twitter are online as well. And I'll leave it on the questions and answers for the remainder of my time so we can finish out, and present Jeff, not this past Jeff, can start and continue answering your questions there. All right, thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful day.